Mackerel Mayhem. Ready to dive in?
It's a pretty catchy title, right?
Yeah.
But it really gets at the heart of what we're talking about today, the Faroe Islands and these fishing disputes.
Exactly. We've got a stack of articles here about these disputes over fishing quotas. These disputes, they involve a lot of players, the Faroe Islands, obviously, but also the EU, Norway, Iceland, even a mention of Russia's involvement.
It's a real geopolitical tangle, isn't it?
Yeah,
And the stakes are high.
they are. We're not just talking about, who gets to catch the most fish. This is about economic impacts, international relations being kind of shaky, and then the whole question of sustainability, right? I mean, can these fish populations even handle this level of fishing?
Right, exactly. And it's interesting how these disputes, they've kind of evolved over time. We start with what you might call a herring hustle back in the late 90s.
Okay, the herring hustle. I like that. Tell me more.
So picture this. It's 1997. The Faroe Islands, the EU, Norway, Iceland, even Russia, they all get together and agree on this framework for managing North Sea herring quotas.
So everyone's playing nice, trying to share the herring wealth.
For a while, it seems like it. But then, fast forward to 2013.
Uh-oh. Here comes the drama.
The Faroe Islands make a bold move. They decide to unilaterally triple their herring quota.
Triple. Wow. That's got to ruffle some feathers.
Yeah.
What was their reasoning there?
Their argument was that the original agreement, it didn't really account for this increased presence of herring in their waters. Basically, more fish, more catch, right?
Seems kind of logical on the surface, I guess, but I'm sure it wasn't that simple.
You're right, it wasn't. This move, it caused a lot of controversy, both internationally and even within the Faroe Islands themselves.
Oh, really? Tell me about that.
Well, you had this Faroes media outlet, Dimulating, and they were pretty critical of how the Faroes government was handling this whole thing, especially the way they were allocating these new fishing rights.
Interesting. So it sounds like there were some internal political dynamics at play here, too, not just international disputes.
Absolutely. And to make things even more complicated, you have to consider the economic side of things. These increased herring quotas, they had the potential to be a huge financial boon for the Faroe Islands.
Yeah, I bet. We're talking serious money here, right?
We are. We're talking about a potential windfall of 1.7 billion kroner.
Whoa. Okay, now I see why they were willing to maybe stir the pot a bit. That's a significant chunk of change, especially for the Faroe Islands.
It is, and that's just the herring. Wait till we get to the mackerel.
Oh, I know, the mackerel. That's where things really heat up, right? From what I've read, it sounds like the Faroe Islands took a similar approach with the mackerel as they did with the herring, asserting their right to a larger share of the catch.
You've done your homework. They definitely did. And let me tell you, the EU, Norway, and Iceland were not thrilled about it.
Not thrilled at all, I imagine.
Neither.
So how did they respond? Did they try to negotiate or?
Well, the EU, they were messing around. They slapped trade sanctions on the Faroe Islands in 2013 because of these mackerel quota demands.
Sanctions. Wow, okay. This is serious business. So how did these negotiations even go down? Can you paint a picture of what it was like?
All right, so imagine this. It's 2011. We're in Clonakilty, Ireland, of all places. Representatives from the EU and Norway are practically begging Iceland and the Faroe Islands to reconsider their demands for larger quotas. Their message was clear: unsustainable fishing should not be rewarded.
So they were worried about overfishing and the long-term health of the mackerel population, right?
Precisely. They knew that if those mackerel numbers crashed, it would be devastating, not just for the ecosystem, but for the economies that rely on them.
It's like a high-stakes poker game. The fate of the mackerel, the livelihoods of fishermen, it's all on the line.
You got it. And the stakes only get higher as we move forward in time.
Right, because this was back in 2011. So what's the situation now? Fill us in.
Well, fast forward to 2024, and there's a new agreement on the table between the Faroe Islands, Norway, and the UK. And this time, the Faroe Islands had to make some concessions. They've agreed to a significantly smaller mackerel quota compared to what they were after before.
So I'm guessing this new agreement, it's not exactly what the Faroes fishing industry was hoping for. A smaller quota, that's going to have some pretty big consequences for them, right?
Yeah, it's a real blow, economically speaking. The estimates are saying they're probably going to lose something like 74 million kroners in fishing fees just in 2024 alone.
74 million. Oof. That's a hefty chunk of change. But, every cloud has a silver lining, as they say. Are there any potential upsides for the Faroes fishing industry with this new deal?
You're right. Sometimes a change in perspective can make all the difference. So yeah, while it's a smaller quota overall, one thing it does give them access to fishing grounds with a higher quality of mackerel over in Norwegian and British waters. And that higher quality, well, that means they can potentially charge higher prices. So there's that.
Okay, so it's a trade-off, I guess. Quality over quantity. But still, it sounds like the Faroe's mackerel industry, they've got some tough challenges ahead, especially with what's going on in Russia right now, their main export market. And this whole situation, it really highlights just how complex it is to manage these shared fish stocks, on a global scale. These fish, they don't exactly follow international borders.
It's the perfect example, really. You've got these overlapping claims, competing interests, and then this added layer of, well, the fish themselves not exactly respected the rules we try to impose.
Right. And that's where organizations like ICES come in, right? The International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. They're the ones trying to make sense of all this and provide some kind of guidance, right?
Exactly. ICS, they're like the scientific advisors in all of this. They gather data, study the fish populations, and then they offer recommendations for these sustainable fishing limits, so we don't completely wipe out the fish.
So they're kind of like referees, trying to keep things fair and sustainable.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They provide the data and the recommendations, but at the end of the day, it's up to the individual countries, to actually implement them.
And as we've seen, that's often where things can get a little, shall we say, tense. Everyone's got their own interests, their own pressures, and sometimes those things, they don't exactly line up with what's best for the fish or even for everyone in the long run.
It's true. It's this balancing act, trying to find a way to protect the environment, keep the fishing industry afloat, and navigate these delicate international relations.
It's a lot. And let's not forget about the legal side of all this. I mean, we've been talking about quotas and sanctions and agreements, but there's a whole other layer here, right? The laws and treaties that are supposed to provide a framework for how all of this gets worked out. And that's kind of your area of expertise, so maybe you can shed some light on this for us.
Sure, it's definitely a complex web, legally speaking.
Yeah.
You've got things like the World Trade Organization, the WTO, for example. They step in when these fishing disputes, they turn into trade disputes, like those sanctions we were talking about earlier.
So the WTO, they're the ones who come in if someone breaks the rules of the trade game, so to speak.
Exactly. And then you've got the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS for short. That's a big one.
UNCLOS. That one rings a bell, but I'll be honest, I don't know all the ins and outs.
Well, it's basically the rule book for the oceans.
Wow.
UNCLOS, it covers everything from territorial waters to fishing rights on the high seas, all that stuff. So these fishing disputes, they often come down to how different countries interpret those rules, how they apply them to specific situations.
It sounds like a recipe for, well, more disputes.
It can be. And in
Really?
researching for this deep dive, we came across the work of Dr. Bjorn Kunoy, an expert on maritime law and all things fishing.
Okay. What does Dr. Kunoy have to say about all of this?
Well, he's particularly concerned about what these disputes could mean for the Danish realm.
The Danish realm. Now, hold on. I'm going to need a little refresher here. What exactly does that refer to?
Oh, good point. Not everyone's up on their Danish political structures. Basically, the Danish realm, it's Denmark, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland, all kind of bundled together. Denmark handles things like foreign policy and defense for the whole group, but the Faroe Islands and Greenland, they have a lot of autonomy, especially when it comes to managing their own resources, like fisheries.
Okay, so there's this delicate balance between the autonomy of the Faroe Islands and the relationship with Denmark. So what does this have to do with the fishing disputes?
Well, Dr. Kunoy's argument is that these disputes, they could end up putting a strain on that relationship.
Interesting. How so?
Well, think about it. Denmark, they're obligated to support the Faroe Islands, right? But at the same time, they also want to stay on good terms with the EU, Norway, all those other countries involved. So they're caught in the middle, trying to keep everyone happy, which, let's be honest, is a tough job when it comes to something as contentious as fishing rights.
No kidding. It's a tightrope walk, that's for sure. And then on top of all of this, we have climate change adding another layer of complexity. I mean, it's already impacting fish migration patterns, and we can only expect those impacts to become more pronounced in the years to come.
Exactly. We're basically playing a game with a constantly shifting playing field. The agreements we make today, the quotas we set, they might not be relevant in a few years if the fish decide to move to cooler waters.
It's like we're trying to solve yesterday's problems with today's solutions, but by the time we implement them, the whole game has changed. Kind of a scary thought when you think about it.
It is a bit daunting. But I think it also highlights the importance of adaptability. We need a system for managing these shared fish stocks that can keep pace with these changes, whether they're driven by climate change or, shifting market demands or whatever it might be.
So what does that look like, a system like that? What needs to change?
Well, for starters, I think we need to get a lot smarter about how we manage these resources. And by that, I mean more research, better data, a deeper understanding of how these ecosystems are responding to these changes. We can't manage what we don't understand, right?
Right. Knowledge is power, as they say. But it's more than just research, isn't it? I mean, we have these agreements like UNCLOS, but they seem kind of, I don't know, rigid maybe? Like they're not really equipped to deal with this kind of rapid change.
I think that's a fair assessment. It's not like we can just tear up the rule book and start from scratch, but we definitely need to find ways to make these agreements more adaptable, more responsive to the realities of a changing climate.
So more flexibility, more room for adjustments as needed. What else? What other pieces need to fall into place?
Well, this might seem obvious, but I think it's worth emphasizing cooperation.
Mhm.
We need more of it.
It,
And by that, I mean genuine collaboration between countries, sharing not just data, but also best practices, resources, even maybe joint management strategies. We can't just keep operating in our own little silos. This is a global challenge that requires a global response.
it's like that old saying, we're all in the same boat.
Exactly. Or maybe, in this case, we're all fishing in the same pond.
Okay, that's a good one. I
Yeah.
like that. We're all fishing in the same pond, so we better figure out a way to share it. It's been fascinating to really dig into this topic with you today, to go beyond the headlines about mackerel mayhem and really grapple with the complexities, the challenges, and, maybe even some glimmers of hope for the future.
I agree. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the doom and gloom, but I think it's important to remember that we're not powerless in all of this. We have the knowledge, we have the tools, and I believe we have the capacity to find solutions, but it's going to take all of us working together.
Well said. So, to our listeners, we'll leave you with this as we navigate these increasingly turbulent waters, both literally and figuratively. What will it take to create a future where both the fishing industry and the ocean itself can thrive? What innovations, what collaborations will chart a course toward a more sustainable and equitable future for all? Food for thought, everyone. Until next time, keep exploring.